If you've been using Mac OS for quite a while, you probably remember an era when ATI, later bought by AMD, and Nvidia shipped GPU solutions both at the same time for Mac OS. And in fact, Apple was sourcing chipsets from both manufacturers. So what happened to Nvidia? Well, that's kind of a convoluted story and the topic of this video. For this video, I wanted to crack a beer from 2015, which is the last year that Apple ever shipped a computer using an Nvidia chipset. Cracking tip-top coldest, coolest craft beer over some handcrafted hip-hop beats, this is the definitive Mac upgrade guide. My name is Greg. The last Mac that officially shipped with the Nvidia GPU was the MacBook Pro mid-2014 15-inch, which sported the Nvidia GT 750M. So what happened? Today we're going to take a look at the saga of Nvidia versus Apple. In the description of this video, I'm going to cite all my sources because I'm not some other YouTubers. Anyhow, I really hate to admit this, but Apple Insider tracked this story better than any other publication. They're always one of the most evangelical sites, always presenting Apple as the protagonist or verging on shilling for Apple, like it did with Lightning Cable DRM. Now, this is entirely off the top of my head, but as I recall, the first Nvidia GeForce to ship to the Mac OS was the GeForce 2 MX with the G4 digital audio back in 2001, marking the beginning of Apple and Nvidia's relationship. And if my memory continues to serve me correctly, Apple got the GeForce 3 before Windows did, and this was after the Quake 3 beta came out on Mac OS first too. The same year that Quake 3 was released for both Mac OS and Windows on the same day, Bungie would demo at Macworld 1999 its new game called Halo: Combat Evolved. And this is as good as Mac gaming ever got. A beta first, a simultaneous release, a game that almost never came out for the Mac, and a GPU. First. The reason I remember this date is because I had a G4 digital audio with a GeForce 2 MX. Then on accelerateyourmac.com, I found a forum thread where Mac users were trying to flash PC GeForce 3s to use the Mac firmware lifted from the Mac version of the GeForce 3. Sensing opportunity, I was able to email the guy who had the firmware, and he emailed it back to me. I then proceeded to buy not one, but two VisionTech GeForce 3s. One for me and one to sell so I could help fund my new purchase. I took these two graphics cards to my friend's house where he had a PC and I was able to flash both graphics cards. Now this was a different era, so I had to use DOS, which was not the greatest experience using the mvflash.exe. I was basically the fourth guy on the internet to pull this off, and then once I was done, I felt like the ultimate digital badass. But the reality was all I did was read some PC documentation, then reported it back to the Mac community and accelerateyourmac.com. The funny thing is though, between this and one other forum thread that dealt with GeForce 2 MXs, plus a guide written by another forum user, and my 4 Dummies guide written by me, kicked off an entire era of Mac video card flashing. And maybe it's the beer talking, but I thought that was a good story. I have more of those. In 2004, Apple's 30-inch cinema display was supposedly delayed by Nvidia's GeForce 8600 Ultra yields as they were not able to produce enough cards in a timely enough fashion for Apple's liking. But Apple continued to offer plenty of other Nvidia options. Remember, this was a different era for Apple, and Intel Macs were still 2 years out. This is a nice history footnote, but I don't think this really affected the relationship in the long run with Apple and Nvidia. Now, 2008, on the other hand, was a lot different. Back in 2004, Intel and Nvidia joined forces in a patent licensing agreement for Intel CPUs with integrated memory controllers. The chipsets had the ultra-catchy names of NCP79 and the NCP89. I'm guessing both companies' marketing and branding guys were just not into this or out to lunch or something. Then in 2008, Nvidia produced Nehalem, and yes, that's pronounced Nehalem. That's a town in Oregon, and I'm an Oregonian, so I'm laying claim to this one. Nvidia produced Nehalem-based chipsets that bypassed the Intel Northbridge and the Southbridge controllers. That's the memory controller and the I/O controller chipsets. Apple was the first PC maker to adopt Nvidia's new chipset as far as I can tell. For Apple, the advantage was pretty clear, as Apple was going to be able to unify its GPU strategy, as it allowed Apple to stop using the underwhelming Intel integrated GPUs and then to mirror the desktops. At the time, Intel's integrated GPUs were pretty bad and could not support OpenCL, thus limiting the amount of offloading to the GPU that Apple could reliably bank on with the OS. Apple's jump to Nvidia was a bellwether for Intel, which did not want to lose its new crown jewel. And this was despite Apple never co-marketing Intel's products or chipsets on its computers. Apple famously never has had an Intel sticker or logo on any of its products. Intel then filed suit against Nvidia, throwing Apple's plans into disarray. Neither company was endeared to Apple, as the squabble had many people speculating that Apple might actually look into AMD processors, even though AMD really had nothing to offer in the laptop space and wasn't truly competitive at this time. Nvidia tried to court Apple into its legal saga, but ultimately failed, leaving Nvidia feeling spurned. Apple also did still have a better relationship with Intel, as it enjoyed a favored position in Intel's universe, unlike Nvidia's universe. Apple continued to use Nvidia GPUs, but sadly its lower-end offerings were constrained to Intel's supremely mediocre integrated GPUs. Meanwhile, in 2008, Nvidia was hit with a securities lawsuit around knowingly shipping faulty GPUs and trying to mitigate the problem through a firmware fix. This ultimately cost $196 million for replacements for Nvidia. HP at the time said it had 24 models of laptops affected and Dell had 15. Apple had 2 models. Sure enough, GPUs were failing at a regular clip, and Apple had to extend its warranties for consumers in 2009 to all the way out to 2012 and issued a software update for the 2009 trying to mitigate the GPU issues. Nvidia saw Apple as a smaller player and refused to extend the support costs beyond an unknown amount of money, putting another twist in the Apple-Nvidia relationship. This, by most accounts, was the dividing moment. Apple wasn't willing to go to bat against Intel, so Nvidia saw Apple as not the greatest partner. By this point, multiple publications reported a frosty air between Nvidia and Apple, although the high-end MacBook Pros would continue to use Nvidia GPUs for some time. In 2013, Nvidia went litigious against its rivals Samsung and Qualcomm over mobile graphics patents, filing a lawsuit over mobile GPUs, going as far as to try and block shipments of the Samsung Galaxy S, Note, and Tab lines, with speculations that Nvidia wanted a piece of the iOS and Android business, with the effect of endearing itself even less to Apple. 2013 marked a strong shift away from Nvidia to AMD with its partnership with custom variations of the Radeon Fire Pros for the Mac Pro 2013s. Then in 2014, when Apple introduced its first 5K iMac, Apple went with AMD chipsets over Nvidia. Finally, Apple moved its MacBook Pro in 2015 to AMD chipsets. I can't find this anecdote, but I really wanted to include it because Apple publicly stated that AMD had a better performance per watt ratio. If this is true, please link me that statement. I really want to see it. Then things got really quiet. Nvidia had ported CUDA to macOS and continued to maintain it, and also released web drivers. These were drivers that you could download and install on macOS so you could use off-the-shelf Nvidia GPUs. Adobe openly embraced CUDA even on macOS, and thus it earned a favored position among professionals, especially anyone using the Adobe suite. Nvidia's drivers also extended support beyond the Kepler chipsets that Apple once used to Maxwell and Pascal chipsets. To circle back to another personal anecdote in my relationship to this topic, I wrote an article on how to install a GeForce 700 series into a classic Mac Pro. Many people were surprised by this, as it was not well documented by Nvidia. Later, I would write a listicle-style article of upgrades you could do to a classic Mac Pro. This is the origins of the definitive Mac Pro upgrade guide. and quite frankly, I'm embarrassed by it. You can find it, but please don't look at it. Later, I'd follow up with another article on the GeForce 1000 series and how to install it, and this one was a little better written. I do know through my web traffic history that a lot of people read these articles, and some of them probably even went out and bought graphics cards based on this recommendation. I kind of feel bad about it, but also, I had no idea what was going to happen with macOS Mojave. Outside of the people on Infinite Loop, no one knew for certain that Apple's grand ambition was to merge macOS and iOS hardware. We all speculated that bringing Metal from iOS to macOS was to make development easier for Apple and provide a modern graphics API that covered both compute and graphics acceleration. For years, Microsoft had a huge leg up in the graphics department by owning its own graphics API in the form of DirectX. Apple developing its own graphics API most certainly was inspired by Microsoft and also being burned by OpenGL. While the open source replacement Vulkan was just in its infancy, Apple decided to develop Metal for its iPhones. This was a very smart move because Vulkan would take years to complete, and Apple was able to ship Metal way before that and then port it to macOS. macOS 10.14 Mojave required Metal-compatible GPUs in order to even display an accelerated picture in macOS. At some point during the macOS Mojave beta, Apple pulled Nvidia's ability to sign its code and release its drivers. Nvidia publicly announced that it had working Metal drivers on its forum, but Apple had revoked its developer license, leaving the blame squarely at Apple's feet. Nvidia even called out Apple on its support page, but has now since modified it. Now, we don't know the full story. My personal speculation is it has to do with CUDA, Metal, and the M1. CUDA represented a significant problem for Metal adoption. In order to get professional applications on board with Metal, they had to cut out CUDA, and my guess is that Nvidia was not willing to give up CUDA in its driver set. And this is my personal speculation yet again, that this is the impasse between Apple's management and Nvidia. In order for Apple to launch Apple Silicon very smoothly, they needed everyone to be supporting Apple's current technologies. And CUDA was a roadblock to that success. Apple also knew the aftermarket install base for Nvidia GPUs was quite small and limited to classic Mac Pro users and the adventurous people who had eGPUs, and the Hackintosh community, which Apple has mostly ignored. So it was pretty much a no-brainer. It only screwed over people like myself and probably maybe some of the people who are watching this video. Since the Nvidia-Apple feud, the goalposts have now changed. The question isn't whether Nvidia and Apple will get along, it's whether Apple will allow external GPUs or dedicated GPUs at all. As of recording this, Mac Rumors on its buyer's guide page lists that it thinks that Apple will release GPUs that outstrip AMD and Nvidia's current offerings. Usually Mac Rumors is pretty on point, but I'm just hyper skeptical. The year-over-year gains in the GPU market has been not just consistent, but actually going up. Also, Nvidia and AMD are two of TSMC's biggest clients. They too will have access to the same manufacturing processes as Apple. And they've been doing it much longer, and they're very good at it. I have a very unusual take on this whole thing, and that is that in the future, we're going to see Macs that absolutely rock at laptop performances and low wattages. Also, we'll probably see iMacs in a year or two that can edit 8K natively, but also can't ray trace and are pretty crap when it comes to things like TensorFlow. To quote myself after I received my first Apple Silicon Mac in December of 2020, "For the portable class of computing, Apple Silicon looks like it'll be unmatched and expensive. Brute force versus efficiency will be the story of x86 versus Apple Silicon versus ARM, and I expect there will always be a clear winner." Welcome to the next decade of computing. This video is a little different than my usual fare, as I'm usually just doing videos that are a how-to or tutorial style. So please let me know what you thought, and if I should do more of these kind of style. I had a lot of fun doing this, and I got to walk down memory lane, as I'm apparently old now. So thanks for watching. If you had a different take than I did, or you found something incorrect in this video, please let me know down in the comments, as I am not the arbiter of truth on this topic.